Over the course of the War of the Spanish Succession, the leading European engraving studios produced thousands of plates depicting episodes from the conflict. These prints were signed by some of the most well-known figures in the engraving, the cartographic, and the publishing worlds, from cities like Amsterdam, Augsburg, Brussels, and Paris. These prints provided European public with information about the military campaigns, the theaters of the war, and the main political events. They were often intentionally produced as propaganda, as could be noticed in their iconography, with symbols and allegorical figures that exalted the power and the military might of the confronted houses, as well as in the texts that accompanied them. Catalonia was one of the main theaters in the War of the Spanish Succession, and it is therefore the subject of many prints from the period. This is particularly true in the case of the Catalan capital, Barcelona, which became since 1705 the Spanish court of Archduke Charles of Austria, King Charles III of the Catalans. The city was generally depicted as seen from the sea, dominated by its fortifications and its principal civil and religious buildings, such as the Palau Real and Santa Maria del Mar. Mount Montserrat, one of the most famous spiritual centers in Europe, was also frequently linked to images of the city. Engraving plates were valuable objects that were reused for years, with slight variations. That is why anachronisms can be found in them at times. This is the case, for example, of the inclusion of El Rosselló and La Sardana counties in maps of Catalonia, even though the Principality had lost these territories in 1659. The most reliable information about the war theatre and the military operations was that provided by the army engineers. In the case of Catalonia, Francesc de Santa Cruz, a captain of engineers from the Catalan army, and his plans of the siege of Barcelona in 1713 to 1714 stand out. Engravings were very useful for spreading news. On occasion, they were brought together in collections or series that, with titles like The Theatre of War, became veritable graphic histories of the conflict. These outstanding collections include Representatio Belli, published by Jeremias Wolff in Augsburg, and the series on the final siege of Barcelona, produced by Jacques Rigaud in Paris. Engravings printed about the war could illustrate texts, served as artworks, or express political criticism. An example of this can be found in the prints published about Philip V and Cardinal Portocarrero. The stories that these engravings tell us about build up a magnificent chronicle of a war that meant the end of Catalonia's laws and constitutions, as well as other serious consequences. Later, in the 19th century, new depictions of the war were printed in Catalonia. They would help creating a powerful collective imagery with regard to the country's past, which has survived to our day. The War of Spanish Succession broke out in Europe as the consequence of a complex international political situation in which various European powers disputed hegemony both on the continent and on the New World. In November 1700, Charles II, the last Spanish sovereign of the House of Austria, died without issue. In a will made shortly before his death, he had named the Duke of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, and the future Philip V, as his successor to the vast territories ruled by the Spanish crown. This decision was detrimental to the rights of succession of Archduke Charles of Austria, the son of Emperor Leopold I. The proclamation of a member of the powerful House of Bourbon as king was a matter of concern for England and Holland, who joined together with the Austrian Empire to form the Grand Alliance of The Hague to oppose France. Philip V and Archduke Charles of Austria did battle for the Spanish crown in a long war that left nearly 1,250,000 dead, that has to be considered as the First World War. The Catalans accepted Philip V as their king. In autumn 1701, Philip came to the Principality to swear allegiance to its laws and constitutions, under which Catalonia was a sovereign state in the Kingdom of Spain. During Philip's sojourn in Catalonia, two solemn events took place: the celebration of the Corts in Barcelona and his marriage to Maria Luisa Gabriela of Savoy in Figueras. However, when war broke out in Europe, many Catalans began to support the Austrian cause. This was due particularly to the behavior of Philip V's representatives in the country, who had shown contempt for the Catalan authorities and laws, just as had happened before with other viceroys, commonly non-Catalans. Moreover, the bitter memories from recent wars with France and the heavy burden that lodging and billeting the troops had represented were still alive in the people's mind. 3 years later, the situation had changed radically. On the 7th of November 1705, Archduke Charles of Austria was acclaimed king in the Catalan capital, after having laid siege to it and forcing it to surrender. The Spanish court of Charles III was then installed in Barcelona. The city also witnessed another solemn event on the 1st of August 1708, when the king married Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel in the church of Santa Maria del Mar. In April 1706, at the head of his army, Philip V attempted to recapture Barcelona. Bringing enormous military might to bear, he laid siege to the city by land and sea. Just a few kilometers separated Philip V from Charles III. By early May, Barcelona seemed lost, when suddenly the tables were turned. The much-feared Anglo-Dutch fleet had appeared on the horizon. The besieger was now the besieged. Philip V fled to Roussillon, whilst his army beat a chaotic retreat, leaving behind some 2,000 wounded and large amounts of ammunition. As chance would have it, the chaos of the withdrawal was heightened by a long eclipse of the sun, an event that was exploited by the Allies, who claimed it was a divine sign in favor of Charles III. That military success enabled the army of Charles III to advance into Spain as far as Madrid. However, the Allies' victorious march ground to a halt in 1707, after a severe defeat at the Battle of Almansa, which was decisive to the final outcome of the war and meant the loss of Valencia and Aragon. Many people from Valencia and Aragon that supported Charles II went into exile in Catalonia. That same year, Lleida surrendered after a cruel siege, suffering a repression that was no less bloody. Tortosa capitulated in 1708, and with it, the Allies lost a vital strategic point. And in 1711, also Girona, Balaguer, Cervera, and Calaf also fell into Philip V's hands. Towards the end of that year, Charles III achieved some military success at Cardona and Els Prats del Rei, but the tide had turned against him once more due to the gradual withdrawal of his allies' armies. On the 27th of September 1711, Charles III left Catalonia. He headed for Frankfurt, where he was to be crowned as emperor after the death of his brother Joseph I. Charles could become the most powerful monarch in Europe if he succeeded in joining the two empires, the Austrian and the Spanish. Faced by this possibility, England began secret peace talks with France and withdrew its armies from the war front in 1712. Portugal shortly followed suit. Finally, in April 1713, the warring states signed the Treaty of Utrecht, and the conflict came to an end. Philip V was recognized as King of Spain, and although Charles III did not renounce his claim to the Spanish throne, an armistice was agreed. During the peace negotiations, the preservation of its political sovereignty, a key concern for Catalonia, was not resolved, despite the fact that England had committed to its defense in the Treaty of Genoa signed in 1705. Facing that situation, the Catalan authorities met to decide what to do: surrender, losing their laws and freedoms, or continue the war. On the 6th of July 1713, after intense debate, Catalonia resolved to continue fighting against Philip V. This was a heroic decision, but also a daring one. By the summer of 1713, nearly all of Catalonia was in the hands of Philip V. Barcelona and Cardona continued putting up resistance. 90,000 soldiers from Philip V's armies were gathered in Catalonia. Almost 40,000 soldiers were deployed in Barcelona. After 8 months of siege, the situation in the Catalan capital worsened when in March 1714, France and Austria signed another peace treaty in Rastatt. This enabled Louis XIV to intervene more directly with his army in Catalonia. Determined to end the case of the Catalans, the Sun King sent one of his finest generals, the Duke of Berwick, to the aid of his grandson, Philip V. The Duke reached Barcelona on the 7th of July. Thousands of soldiers began to dig trenches approaching the Llevant wall. Meanwhile, artillery fire punished this section, which lay between the Portal Nou and the Santa Clara gates. At the same time, a French squadron prevented supplies from reaching the city from the Balearic Islands. The situation in Barcelona that summer of 1714 was one of extreme suffering. The defenders of the city, led by General Antonio de Villarroel, managed to repel an attack on the 12th to 14th of August. But it was only a matter of time before another attempt was launched. In early September, the Duke of Berwick called upon the city to surrender, but with outstanding heroism, the decision was taken to continue fighting. A week later, on September the 11th, thousands of troops entered the Catalan capital. After 10 hours of fierce fighting, the city surrendered. More than 20,000 people were killed or wounded in the siege of Barcelona. The population suffered immensely, and the city was devastated by bombardment after 14 months of resistance. Cardona fell a week later, and Majorca surrendered in 1715. After the war, the new Bourbon authorities brought terrible repression to bear. The Generalitat of Catalonia and the Conseil de Cent were dissolved. Possession of weapons was banned. Thousands of documents referring to the previous period were burned. And despite the assurances given by the Duke of Berwick, many leaders from amongst the supporters of the House of Austria were imprisoned. Between 25,000 and 30,000 people went into exile in what is considered the first great wave of exile in the country's contemporary history. By enacting the Decree of Nueva Planta in 1716, Philip V put an end to Catalonia's political sovereignty. This new order, homogenizing and centralist, also imposed new territorial divisions, known as corregimientos, similar to those of Castile, as well as a fiscal reform with the application of cadastre tax and a mighty military occupation of Catalonia. One of the most emblematic symbols of the repression was La Ciutadella. The purpose of this huge military fortress was to guard against any possible uprisings in Barcelona. In order to build it, La Ribera neighborhood, which formed 1/5 of the urban fabric and was one of the most bustling and densely populated parts of the city, was demolished. The people of Barcelona hated the citadel right up to its demolition in the late 19th century. 3 buildings from this citadel are still standing. These include the former arsenal, today the seat of the Catalan parliament. Despite the repression, censorship, and in short, the passing of time, memories of the war remained alive. In the 19th century, the Catalan nationalist Renaixença movement contributed to the creation of a collective imagery regarding Catalonia's past, in which the loss of Catalan sovereignty and civil liberties on the 11th of September 1714 became a key date, fueling nationalist demands